And now I'm going to move on to the next part, which we are calling execution, as you can see here on our little timeline. And really, there's a lot of practicalities that go into making redistricting happen. The focus today is primarily on the legalities, but we did want to put in some about the practicalities. And so we have 3 different topics coming up, and the first one is data. Now, it is virtually impossible to talk about data in 10 minutes, but we have given that assignment to Jeff Greenfield, who is from Connecticut's legislature, nonpartisan staff, I want to say there. So if you would take it away and do a little magic for us to share what needs to be known in short order. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Wendy, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me participate in this webinar. What I've been asked to discuss today is first the census in general, and then, as Wendy said, to give you some information, hopefully useful information, about the data that you'll be using from the census and other sources as you work on redistricting. I'm sorry, my slides are not appearing. Okay, so thank you very much. Sorry about that. So what is the census? So the United States Constitution requires the census be taken every 10 years. And the effort is to count every person living in the United States on Census Day, April 1, generally at the location where each person usually lives. Now, what's most important right now to benefit New York State is to ensure that everyone is actually counted, particularly groups that we know historically have been undercounted, such as minority groups, people who live in rural areas, undocumented individuals, young children. But you might be interested to know that historically, this is not anything new. And President Washington and Secretary of State Jefferson were also deeply concerned about the undercount when the first census was taken in 1790. Of course, the numbers were a lot smaller then, and since I'm talking to you in New York, I thought I'd note that by 1790, New York City had surpassed Philadelphia to become the most populous city in the country, and of course has stayed that way ever since in every census. Census data is vital to the planning and operation of government, business, nonprofits, healthcare, and so much more. But for our purposes today, we're talking about how the census data determines the apportionment of Congress and then is the basis for the redistricting that you will be doing. So as I've shown here is illustrating apportionment. New York State actually became the most populous state in 1810, surpassing Virginia, and stayed that way for 160 years. But as you can see, starting in the middle of the last century, because New York State's population growth lagged that of the rest of the country, New York has been losing congressional seats. I'm showing here the census questionnaire, and you know you're aware of this. You've hopefully all just filled one out. And what I want to talk about is how it's the answers to these questions which the Census Bureau will release as part of what's called the PL 94-171 redistricting data. And this is the most important data that you will have in redistricting. It will be released at all levels of census geography, and what you will have at every level is, among other things, the total population and the voting age population of every census, every geographic unit, as well as the racial and Hispanic and Latino origin breakdown of those two populations. Now, I want to contrast that with another source of census data, a totally different census product that you should be aware of, and that is the American Community Survey. So while the decennial census is an attempt at a universal count, the ACS, as its name implies, is a survey. It's a very big survey of about 3 million households every year. And as you can see in these two slides, it covers an incredible range of subjects, which potentially gives you insight into pretty much anything you're interested in learning about concerning the communities in your state as you work on redistricting. I do want to note two things about the ACS. First, remember that like any survey or poll, there's a margin of error, and you're very familiar with that. And second, though, if you look at a poll, it's probably taken over a couple of days or a week. It's a snapshot in time. What you should know about the American Community Survey is that the results you'll be looking at will be from 1, 3, or 5 years of survey responses. So understand that there may be a lag if there is change happening in an area. there may be a significant lag before that change shows up in ACS data because some of the survey responses, by the time the data is released, may be as much as 6 years old. But it is still an incredible source of information for you. I want to move on to the census timeline. And like everything else in our society today, this has been dramatically impacted in an unprecedented way by the pandemic. Normally, the self-response phase, as well as the Census Bureau's efforts to follow up with people who don't respond, would have been completed in about a month. Instead, it looks like it'll be October 31st, and other special counts and efforts have been greatly delayed as well. What you therefore should know is that we have always received the apportionment data by the end of the year of the census, and normally you would receive your redistricting data by the middle of February to the end of March in each state of the year following the census. Instead, depending on congressional action, we may not know the apportionment counts until April 30th of next year. And perhaps more importantly for you, we are probably not going to receive the redistricting data until June or July of next year. So that obviously is going to have a very significant impact on your redistricting efforts. I want to turn to making sure you understand census geography. And in the lower left of this census graphic, it depicts a census block. There are more than 11 million census blocks in the country. That's the atom of census geography. And they're made up of the intersection of visible features like roads and streams and railroad tracks and power lines, as well as some non-visible features, such as, for instance, a county or a city line. Groups of, and so that you know, your 94-171 redistricting data will be given to you all the way down to the block level. Groups of blocks are, as you could imagine, known as block groups. And I don't think you'll use block groups very much in your efforts. I will note that ACS data, this is the lowest level of geography that you can get some ACS data, although most ACS data will be at the tract level or higher. Which brings us to tracts, and tracts are a unit of geography I wanted to talk a little bit about with you and make sure you were aware of. Because unlike blocks, tracts actually have consistency over time geographically. The Census Bureau tries to keep them relatively permanent. And tracts have a relationship to population. There's an effort to have the tracts have about an average of about 4,000 people in them. And for instance, if a tract grew a lot, the Census Bureau might have to divide it in half, but it would keep those outer boundaries. That makes tracts a very useful geographic unit if you want to compare demographic statistics or other statistics, either back in time or across communities, because they're relatively small, relatively stable, and have a relatively equal population. And then you work up from tracts to, for instance, counties, and I'll talk a little bit more in a moment. I wanted to just re-emphasize a point about census blocks with this slide. They have no relation to population or area or geography. So that tiny census block in Manhattan has almost 5,000 people. These maps are drawn to scale. The map on the right, which probably is about the area of all of Manhattan in the Adirondacks, that's one census block, which has 3 people in it. Another point I wanted to make, and maybe this is bad news for you, but you're probably going to spend a lot of time explaining the difference between census blocks and streets, because we in the redistricting world redistrict with census geography, but people logically in the real world don't think about their census block, they think about the street they live on. This happens to be the street I grew up on in Rochester, New York, and my home behind it had wetlands. And the point I want to make is that if you were at the block level, and you'll do that a little bit less in a state like New York with bigger districts than in Connecticut, but you will be at the block level sometimes. If you used my street, for example, as a boundary line, people on my side of the street where I grew up would probably be surprised to know that many houses across that wetlands are linked to them, and that the people across the street are not in the same district. And similarly, somebody might ask you, well, I want to include this street in my district, and be surprised to know that that street actually, when you look at the rest of the block, includes an apartment building that they would never have thought of. This is a table that I think you may want to refer back to. It gives the hierarchy of all the census geography, and I've talked about some of these units. All I'll say about this is that you're probably not going to work straight down the middle of the main line. Most likely you're going to work with counties And then you'll branch off and you'll be using county subdivisions like cities and towns, voting districts, state legislative districts in the other area. And your experience may be different than mine, but once you get below those levels, you may go right to the census block level when you need to divide an area more finely than one of those levels. So we've talked a lot, and I'm going to kind of bring it back to all of the data that you'll be using. It'll start with census geography, what's called the Tiger Line files, which will be built into your software. And you will, as I'm sure you participated in the submission programs, you'll have your legislative districts and voting districts also included and have the data readily available from the census. You may want to include other geographic boundaries and information. For instance, there may be neighborhood lines, school districts, court districts, agricultural use patterns, regional planning districts, any kind of geography that you feel helps you as you discuss communities of interest or as you work on your maps could be added in. Then there is the redistricting data that I've discussed in the ACS data. But again, there may be demographic data from think tanks, from local governments, any other data that you're interested in. Remember, you can also run into serious data overload, and so be careful of that. But you can incorporate other sources of data. And then there's the political data. And I understand you certainly use political data in New York State. The two main sources are election returns and voter data. What I want to highlight about election returns, this applies to ACS data and other things. You just always want to be thinking as you work about the level of geography at which the data was collected and any possible errors in it. So for example, your redistricting software will make every number look incredibly precise. 54.7% of the people in the proposed district you drew voted for the Republican candidate for Congress. But of course, if you're breaking a voting district, you don't know how people actually voted. That's obvious. And if, for instance, one side of the voting district has an apartment building and one side has a long-established neighborhood of single-family homes, they may be demographically and politically very different. There are ways to make those estimates better, but they are always going to be estimates. And so anytime you're going below the level of geography, be aware that on top of any error, such as if there was a mistake in reporting the election data in the first place, that's a serious problem. But there's also a second problem brought in when you're doing that. And you'll then use GIS, or Geographic Information System technology, to bring it all together. And even if you haven't worked with GIS directly, you're very familiar with it. If you've ever searched for a restaurant 5 miles away from your location and then chosen a restaurant and asked for the directions to it, think of all the levels of data which have been tied to geography, which gave you the answers to those questions. That's what GIS is doing. And your redistricting software, GIS is perfectly suited to redistricting. Your redistricting software will be very sophisticated. I haven't picked one of the vendors here, but I've shown something that you also should be aware of, which is that people on the internet will be able to do the same thing with less sophisticated but perfectly functional software, such as this old picture of Dave's redistricting app. But the point is, you will be assigning areas of this geography, and then you'll see in the spreadsheets the change to any of the statistics, starting with total population, but then moving to anything else you're interested in. And with that, I think I will conclude. Thank you for listening to me, and I wish you all the best in your redistricting efforts.
Well, Jeff, that was just fabulous. Thank you very much. You